What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and as you might have guessed by looking at your calendar, this will be the final podcast of the year here for me, and as such, it is time for my 2025 Cube Year in Review. This is something that I used to do when I was writing for Star City Games, and it was a pretty different time then, both for Magic and for Cube, and as such, my Cube Year in Review is going to look different than those articles used to look, kind of the same way the podcast is pretty different from my old articles. When new sets would come out, I would typically do a most cubable card list, kind of narrow it down to the 10 cards that I thought were most appealing for a cube broadly. And there's a couple reasons that doesn't really work or make sense to me anymore. The first is that Cube is just so different now with all of the grassroots Cube events popping up, the way that people cube, the kind of cubes that people play. They're just so different. They're so specific. There's a lot of different ways people design things, house rules, desert cubes, breaking singleton, varying power levels. There are still people whose only exposure to Cube is things like the Magic Online Vintage Cube or this year the Magic Arena Powered Cube, but that's just one way to cube, and just looking at sets in terms of what are the best cards for the most powerful things for this kind of cube. It's not the case where if you know a lot of different cubes, it's like modern cube, legacy cube, vintage cube, or just kind of like varying degrees of power level. There's so much more going on. We're talking about a card being broadly cubable. It just makes less sense to me, and I'm at a point where I have over a dozen cubes myself that I curate, and I never need more than 4 copies of a new card. In some ways, there's a restriction that I pose on myself there, like I don't want to own more than 4 copies of Shockland, so my designs look pretty different, but Cube is so expansive, it is infinitely customizable, that every cube looks so different. Even just looking at my own collection, this is very loudly true, and as I look at the kind of cubes that people are building, talking about, drafting at these cube events, it is very loudly true. So speaking about cards being broadly cubable, when the hit rate for any individual card being printed for my own cubes is it's not going to go in more than 1/3 of my cubes realistically, less than that for almost any card. It just doesn't make a ton of sense to talk about cards being broadly cubable. And the state of Magic also has changed in a way that lines up with this, where if you look at all the releases in 2025, and if you look ahead to 2026, Magic has become really specific, and I'm not just talking about Universes Beyond. People have very strong feelings about that. Even players who generally enjoy Universes Beyond, there's some IPs that they don't really get into. People skip sets. It's just a more natural thing now. There's so many sets, you just have to. Not everything is going to be for you, and things get really specific. I think if you look at the releases this year, this is equally true of the in-universe sets. Ether Drift was the first release of this year, and there was a lot of commotion. A lot of people just didn't like the multiversal racing aesthetic. Edge of Eternities was, at least as far as I could see on my social feeds, received better by a lot of Magic players, but even still, that sci-fi aesthetic, it's tremendously specific. So it's going to be the case, I think, where Magic is at right now. Setting aside Universes Beyond completely, there's going to be a lot more picking and choosing, a lot more focus on aesthetic resonance. And there is also kind of just 2 tiers of that. Every set is going to be received both in terms of aesthetics and mechanics. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in my Cube Year in Review. You know, when I used to do those top 10 lists, when I did my year in review, it made sense to me to go back, review my lists, see what I hit, what I missed in the set, what I misevaluated. I think that for my review now, when I do initial set reviews, when a set comes out, I've been doing a breakdown where I first talk about the set's mechanics and themes, and then I do an episode on individual cards. And what I really want to focus on today is looking again at those mechanics and themes for every set to talk about what has been enduring, what really works internally for a set in terms of its mechanics and aesthetics. Because when they market a set, really now you can tell that they are leaning on aesthetics first. That's very loudly true with Universes Beyond. But I would argue that it's equally true of all of the in-universe sets. As Etherdart's coming out, we're all talking about the racing set, how we feel about that in Magic with Tarkir Dragonstorm. People were talking about a return to Tarkir. Not a lot of focus on what the mechanics are. It's just, okay, cool, we're going back to a world that we know. That's what a lot of the conversation, as I perceived it, was. With Edge of Eternities, a lot of the focus is on we're getting a new world in Magic. How do we feel about sci-fi in Magic? How do we feel about going to the edge? What's going on in this world? And what's cool about that? And then over time, what becomes enduring is how well these sets landed mechanically. So I want to talk a bit about just how my impressions of these set has shifted over time. I don't have a first impression out there for all the sets released this year. I've only been doing this podcast for a couple months. But what I want to do today is go over one by one all of the major releases for Magic in 2025, talk about the set's aesthetics, the set's mechanics, and how those things have landed over time, just to review how this year has been for Magic. So we got 6 major releases to go over. It's a lot of material to talk about today. Let's dig in. Alright, so the first set released this year was Aetherdrift and the corresponding Aetherdrift Commander decks. Aesthetically, this is the multiversal racing set, and then mechanically, I'll go over all the mechanics here. There is Exhaust, which isn't really a new mechanic, it's just giving a keyword to once per game abilities. Start Your Engines, or the Speed emblem as I tend to refer to it. Vehicles plus mounts being used as a package. Neither vehicles nor mounts were new in this set, but cards that referred to vehicles or mounts, so you could really kind of build this racing world, was new. And then cycling matters being the other big mechanic. And just across the board, I think all of the mechanics in this set are excellent. I really enjoy everything going on here, and I like the execution of all of these. I'll go one by one and really break that down. But just generally, my only complaint that I have about any of this is that there's maybe not enough to really go into building a cube that's really about all of this stuff. But it's all things that we have either seen before and or I would be excited to see more of in the future. So starting with Exhaust is nothing new, it's just something that's always been in Magic, but now it has a keyword that references, which allows you to build some synergies with it. It is a great choice of a name because Exhaust both speaks literally to the aesthetics of this set. Exhaust makes a lot of sense in the racing context, and also it just is a pretty simple word to understand in the context. If you use it one time, it is now exhausted. And in fact, this mechanic shows up on several cards from Avatar: The Last Airbender, so it's already been reused. Really easy for this to show up in multiple times. Just individual cards that have exhaust abilities have proven to be really fun. Draconautics Engineer is a really cool one. Just a 2-mana 2/2 that has an ability like once per game you can make a dragon. Once per game you can haste up your team. Some really nice stuff there. Grease-Wrench Goblin, a really nice 2/1, just like making a Jackal Pup kind of creature that has a once per game to make it more effective in the long game is a pretty cool way to use this ability. And I am hopeful that we see a set that's a little bit more build about exhaust in the future, so that you can see some of the things like abilities that say you can use exhaust abilities multiple times to open up synergy there. I really like the card Afterburner Expert, which is a 3-mana 4/2 that can return from your graveyard to the battlefield when you use an exhaust ability. And so this is the kind of thing that becomes more and more relevant in Cube as something you can really build around if we see exhaust in more sets in the future, which I have to imagine that we will. I think this is just a slam dunk mechanic. And then as far as individual cards, a lot of great individual cards with this mechanic. Kind of low hanging fruit, but you do have to give credit where it's due. It's something that the set did, and I think the set delivered on it pretty well. The cards that synergize with mounts and vehicles, this territory is a little bit more fraught. It's a little bit more for a set cube. It's really only going to be reinforced as something we can build on if we go into this kind of world or see a set that has a little bit of a raising motif in the future. Just to give an example of what I'm talking about if you're not familiar, Canyon Vaulter, an uncommon, 2-mana 3/1. Whenever this creature saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gains flying until end of turn. So it builds this world of there is a race happening, you can ride a monster, you can drive a vehicle, and this card works with either one. kind of a problem you run into if you want to explore this space, building a cube with cards that aren't just from Ether Drift, is that you get into cards that explicitly only care about vehicles or cards that only care about mounts. You have like the pilot stuff from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, where you have pilots that can crew vehicles as if their power were two greater. No reference to mounts, so if you kind of mix and match throughout the history there, you have to really read every card and be like, okay, is this one vehicles and mounts? Is it just vehicles? It can get kind of granular there. This stuff really works in terms of a set cube if you're only using cards from Ether Drift. And it's also a fair point to say that the checkered flag set symbol is pretty loud, but you can't really rely or force your players to keep up on that. It's worth noting and something to think about as a cube designer. It is a layer of complexity there. I think this really works for the retail limited experience. I think it really works for a set cube. It's something that I like, but I do want to acknowledge it as something that I would really like to see more of before I would really explore this in one of my own cube environments. But it's a cool thing to do if you want to build a racing world. I do like this a lot. It's just unfortunate that, there's just cards that exist that are going to conflict in terms of how they read and how they play with some existing stuff if you want to play with vehicles and mounts in a cube that's not just a set cube. I don't think there's much reason to spend a lot of time talking about cycling. This is just a tried and true mechanic that we see again and again. Cycling plus discard matter stuff is awesome. It's something I use a lot in Spooky Cube. Marauding Mako, just an immediate all-timer for anybody playing in the discard matter cycling space. Just a 1-drop that can grow as you discard and cycle cards, and also has cycling itself. I'm also quite partial to Scrounging Skyray, which is a 2-mana 1/2 with flying that has the exact same rest of the text box. It gets +1/+1 counters whenever you discard cards, and has cycling itself, so you can cycle it if you have other stuff going on. Really cool to be able to facilitate aggressive stuff there. And then you also have Monument to Endurance and some other kind of big cycling payoffs if you want to do things that are a little bit less ABC magic, a little bit less combat oriented. So a lot of great new tools for cycling and discard matters in Ether Drift, tried and true archetypes. I always love to see more of this. Gold star for Ether Drift on the cycling matters and discard matters stuff. And then the last mechanic here, this is maybe going to be a hot take, but I'm just going to say it. Start Your Engines is far and away the best execution of an emblem mechanic that we have yet seen in Magic. And you might say that that is not a very competitive space. There's stuff like the Monarch, which just completely changes the game, so a lot of people just don't have an appetite for it, and it's so powerful that it's really kind of mostly only shows up in power maxing environments. The Initiative, the same thing with an added layer of complexity. I will say that the Initiative is not as complex as people make it out to be. It just says in 2 or 3 turns the game is over. There's more words to it, but once you start playing with it, there's actually not a ton to unpack there. But the big sin of the Initiative is that the power level is so high. And then I think that my actual least favorite emblem mechanic is the Ring Tempts You, because there's a tremendous amount of complexity. There's no shortcutting it. When I see it in cubes, it's usually just like there's one thing that can make the ring tempt you. Maybe you can loop it, and you should just ignore it. It doesn't really do a lot, except it kind of does. Like, it makes the thing legendary. There's a blocking restriction, and if you do it multiple times, I cannot be bothered to remember what the second tier of the Ring Tempts You does. I know that there's 4, but I just barely know what's going on there, and it's just not that interesting, and doesn't really make the game over. Like, I'm more forgiving of the Initiative because at least it ends the game. The abilities are so powerful, but the Ring Tempts You is just really granular, and I find that really irritating. But Start Your Engines just really easily fits on a card. They have the reminder text in its entirety on, I think, every card or most every card that involves speed. It's just a couple lines. If you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life. Max speed is 4. It's all right there. There's some rules follow-up questions you might have, but it's not complicated. It's not a counter, so you can't proliferate it. That's a question people are going to ask, but once you hear no, it makes sense why the answer is no. There's some stuff like if you gain control of a permanent that has Start Your Engines, you get speed that way. It's not a triggered ability. It's a little bit weird, but it's not that complicated. It just doesn't matter that much. So I like that about it. It's really easy to understand this. I like speed if you want to do a package. It makes the most sense to me to do multiple cards so that you have multiple things trying to do max speed. That's the other thing about all of these Start Your Engines cards is anything that says Start Your Engines also just has a payoff when you hit max speed, and they often just fit on one or two lines of the card. So there's kind of a lot going on. It does introduce an emblem. But if you're going to play with emblem mechanics, which is space that is admittedly fraught, this is my pick for the easiest to understand and generally the most fun to play with. It's fun to just announce start your engines. I consider that fun in the same way that I think the four Mirrodin mechanic is very fun. You just get to say that out loud or shout that every time you play something with this. Pretty intuitive, easy to follow along with the most basic gameplay of the mechanic, and the rules, there's not that many clarifications that really ever come up or really ever matter. And then when this mechanic was first introduced, I did think that it made sense to do it as a package to have multiple cards that will have start your engines. So everything is trying to get up to max speed and get your payoffs that way so that you can start your engines sooner, just because you'd be more consistent in doing it if you had multiple cards that have the mechanic. But at this point, I do think this mechanic is simple enough that it makes sense to just have a speed card if you just like the way the card plays. The example I'm going to give is the card Burnout Bastronaut. This card shows up as a 4 of in the standard in decks with no other speed matters thing. It's just a 1 mana 1/1 with Menace. It has Fire Breathing for 2 mana. It gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If you have max speed, it gets double strike. So if you have multiple turns of your opponent losing life, you get up to max speed. This thing can hit pretty hard, has a blocking restriction, gains double strike, and can increase its power. So it's a quest that's worth pursuing. It's a Goblin Warrior, so it's going to make sense if you're pursuing either of those as a creature type that matters. Also, just 1 mana 1/1 Menace. Like, there's a lot of reasons that aspects of this card are going to be appealing. And if you're thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to introduce an emblem mechanic, this one is so easy to track. Like, you really don't even need a die because it's not a number that does anything but goes up. Like, your speed only ever goes from 1 to 4. It's tremendously easy to track this. So I will say, if you have an aversion to emblem mechanics, I understand. This is the one that I will go to bat for. And this is the most, for my money, ambitious mechanic that was set out in any of the sets this year. I think that emblem is really tough to bite off, especially after what I consider colossal failures of both the initiative and the ring attempts you. And this one is just great. I love Start Your Engines, and I gotta say, mechanically, Ether Drift is a set that really does it for me. Really nailing an emblem mechanic is a challenge that I think it is foolish to take on, and I consider this just a success in that regard. The only kind of point I really have against this set is that mounts plus vehicles, they read weird as you introduce them into Magic broadly, but they're clearly just supposed to be an aspect of this set here. I would love to see another racing set or more stuff in this space in the future so you can flesh that out more, but that's a very minor gripe, especially next to the incredible praise of nailing an emblem mechanic. I don't have a ton to say about Aetherdrift Commander. There's 2 Commander decks, and there's actually only 20 unique new cards in both decks combined. There's some energy stuff that is nice. I will say that the hit rate, if you just want to look at the 20 new printed cards in Aetherdrift Commander, more of these are appealing for 1v1 games than you would expect. If you're playing with energy, they're worth looking at. Hashatan Scarab's Fist is like an Esper card that could be something for a high power level discard matters cube. You could explore that space. Wizened Metor is a nice, modest white creature that can build into zombies matter. There's only so many white zombies, which is something that I think is kind of cool if you want to explore zombies as a type that matters. And Ret 2 Mystic is a standout here. Every time there's a very simple card from a commander deck that is rated and plays for 2-player games, there's just a 2 mana 2/1 flyer. Each creature in your hand has cycling for 1 and a blue. Really easy to understand what's going on there. It's not that powerful, like a 2 mana 2/1 flyer, totally reasonable by today's standard, and the ability to just kind of clean up your hand, giving you some ability to cycle your uncastable creatures, or if you're in a position where you just need to draw something, giving you some churn. Really modest card, can show up in a lot of really cool ways. Big fan of that. Aetherdrift Commander, there's not a ton going on, but the hit rate for cards that are appealing and I can see uses for, very high for only having 20 cards. In general, I just think that the power level for Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander just really hits. Everything just seems reasonable and balanced. There is some stuff a little extreme, like Ketramos the New Dawn is really powerful, but it's such a specific build around and it's loud about the ways that it's powerful, so I don't think anybody's really getting tricked by that one. So that just seems reasonable to me. The Gear Hulk cycle is really cool, really restrictive casting costs. They're too powerful for a lot of environments, but they're probably only showing up in high-powered cubes anyway, with like heavy artifact synergies, high-powered Goblin Welder kind of stuff. Stock Up is one of the standout cube cards of the year, a great card that scales to the power level of its environment. Yeah, it's stronger than Divination, but not in a way where it would necessarily feel oppressive in a cube that was flirting with effects like Divination, and then it scales all the way up to Vintage Cube. It's more powerful when the cards you're looking at are more powerful, and it gives you a lot of looks, which is really cool. When it comes to Aetherdrift, I would say aesthetically, it got some pretty mixed reviews from the jump, so you can't give it a perfect grade there, even though I like the aesthetic. But mechanically, I think it's a set that really delivers, really well executed, and I would hope that some of the haters and doubters have come around on the set, a set that I think is quite excellent. The second major Magic release of 2025 was Tarkir Dragonstorm and its corresponding Commander release. This one had 5 Commander decks, one for each of the enemy-colored clans. The Commander decks for this one, a little bit more forgettable, a lot more in the space of 3-color stuff rated for Commander if you control your Commander kind of abilities and mechanics. There's a couple highlights that I could point to in these decks, but they were a lot more forgettable for somebody playing 1v1 Magic mostly and cubing at 40 card decks, 20 life, 1 opponent. There's a lot less that is appealing to me, a lot smaller hit rate. There's some stuff you can pour into if you're interested in the clans here, though. Talking about the main set, the mechanics here, they were focused on these individual factions. So you had Renew was the Sultai mechanic, Mobilize the Mardu mechanic, Harmonize in Teamer, Flurry in Jeskai, and Endure in Abzan. These mechanics are broadly forgettable. I actually had made a list of mechanics to go over for every set before I sat down to record, and I just missed Endure. I just completely forgot what that is. Not a lot going on there. Mobilize is strong. If you put the ability to make tokens on attackers, that's good on well-rated cards. Renew is... Actually, Renew and Flurry are really similar, where they add a keyword to something that we see and is useful. Just exiling a thing for an effect from a graveyard is what Renew does. You can just put that ability on cards. Flurry is just casting 2 spells in a turn. And I was talking about really liking keywording Exhaust and that opening up some synergies with once per game abilities. I don't feel similarly about Renew and Flurry. You could add stuff that makes it better to Renew and stuff that's better to Flurry, but with Flurry, you're kind of just doing it. If you're casting 2 spells a turn, it probably means you're drawing extra cards, probably means you're generating material. Like, you don't really need to make that more of a payoff. These ones, like, everything here just feels really forgettable, not really important to go back and do this again. Mechanically, I think that all of the clan mechanics here are just kind of a overwhelming who cares, a who's who of forgettable mechanics. Harmonize the Teamer one, which is basically flashback. It is nice, you can tap creatures to reduce costs. Most of these, there's individual cards I can point to that I really like, but as mechanics, this is just kind of stuff that fills out a limited file. Where Tarkir does deliver a little bit more, I think being a dragon set, there's some pretty good innovations as far as making dragons matter. Omens as a mechanic, it's a little bit troubled as Omens, just the card frame looks exactly like Adventure but functions differently, where Adventure, the spell goes to exile, you can cast the creature later. If you cast an Omen, then you shuffle the dragon back into your deck. So they look exactly the same. You kind of have to know about the Omen mechanic or read the cards. They look exactly like Adventures, which is a little bit irritating. But I do think as a mechanic, Omen is a great way to get players to put more dragons in a deck. You can do more Dragon Matter stuff. The Sarkhan, the 2-mana Sarkhan in the set's also pretty cool. There's a little bit going on in cheap dragons. Clarion Conqueror, being a 3-mana, 3/3 flying dragon in white, is a pretty good rate, just stuff that gets you more dragons. Mox Jasper is very cool, But even that, there's not a ton. I like Omens. That's definitely the best mechanical execution in the set, but it does come with an asterisk. It's a mechanic that does have some problems. Mostly, I do think that Tarkir does succeed in terms of some standalone individual designs. There's a good spread of appealing cards here. Tersa Light Shatter is really cool. Reasonable rate, 3 mana, 3 haste that gives you some rummaging that has a payoff if you hit threshold. I like that design a lot. Awaken the Honored Dead stands out to me as a relatively simple and appealing 3-color card. I don't spend a lot of time looking at 3-color cards, but that and Inevitable Defeat do stand out to me. Broadly in the file, there's a lot of 3-color stuff that I tune out. There's really complicated cards. The power level of this set in aggregate, I do think that the balance is worse in Dragonstorm than in Ether Drift. There's more stuff that is just for power maxing. Corey Steelcutter, that one quickly caught a ban in Standard. It's really powerful. It sees play in constructed formats all the way back to Legacy. For high power cubes, it's definitely appealing. I'm not personally that into Elspeth Stormslayer, but I know a lot of people do really like that one in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, so it's worth shouting out. Voice of Victory is another really good rate, just 2 mana card for high power environments, synergizes very well with Goblin Bombardment. There's stuff to like here. I'm a pretty big fan of Scavenger Regent that is more powerful, but it's not like Vintage Cube only. The card in the set that I don't have any of my designs, but I have it on my radar, if I ever do Dragon's Matter in a cube, I love the design of Bloomvine Regent. 5 mana, 4/5, green flying dragon. When it or another dragon enters, you gain 3 life. It has an omen. For 3 mana, you search your library for 2 forests, put 1 on the battlefield, 1 in your hand. Awesome card for getting into play more dragons, getting more representation of dragons in green, a color that historically has the fewest dragons and not a lot to do with flying. Is really cool to increase the volume there. So more stuff in this space over time is going to eventually get me to do Dragons Matter. I like that. There is stuff that is just for high power environments. I really hate the card Meringue River Regent because it's so close to something that I would like. It has an appealing omen, it has an appealing creature, and I have been struggling a little bit with the blue 6 mana drop in the original recipe Tubert. I have decided that Frost Titans is not really doing it. I've rotated a little bit in what I want to do there. But Meringue River Regent, like the numbers are just too much. Entering and bouncing 2 things, it's powerful. And then the creature is also just a 6/7? That's gigantic. Like it's just kind of garish. It's too much. It's not powerful enough to be a hallmark of Vintage Cube. It's completely forgettable, I think, if you're going all the way to the highest power levels, but it's not remotely modest. And so the balance here is just weird. You have some stuff that is too pushed, some like Vintage Cube only stuff, some stuff for power maxing only. And then you do get some nice ones, but then you go all the way back to just the mechanics, and the clan mechanics are all just so forgettable. So I think for first impressions, for that initial aesthetic push, returning to Tarkir is something players were very excited about. This set performed really well. It was very popular from the jump. I just think that mechanically this one falls kind of flat. I do find myself wanting for more dragons. I'd be happy to go back to Tarkir again. I don't think that this set is disastrous by any means, and to the extent there's a lot of stuff that's really pushed, there is still a healthy roster of cool cards here, like the Siege Cycle, which are 2-color and you choose one clan or the other. Those designs are all really cool. Just the power band's a little wide here, and mechanically, this set just did not deliver. I feel like a lot of that initial popularity, it's based on nostalgia. People are excited to go to a plane that we know. It makes sense. I really was playing a lot of Magic and enjoyed original Tarkir. When they did the flashback of Khans of Tarkir limited on Arena, I very much felt that that set did not hold up. And so I kind of think that Tarkir Dragonstorm, a lot of what's going on with Tarkir is really nostalgically driven. And if there is a return to Tarkir, I would like to see a heavier mechanical focus. There are some individual designs that really shine through here. Some really cool cards. I do think the space with omens is very appealing. It's cool cool to explore there, ways to get players to put more of these expensive dragons in their deck. You have some cards like, I mean, Corey Steel Color is clearly a design mistake, but I can see why you would like that card. I certainly enjoyed playing it in Standard. It's something that I have been playing in Modern, other constructed formats. It's cool, and it's powerful in a way that's not ruinous for Eternal formats, the way that original Tarkir was a full-on disaster with Delve. So this one's really a mixed bag. It's hard for me to give Tarkir great marks because I think aesthetically it was kind of just appealing to something that exists and you were familiar with it, which familiarity is an important tool, but I think that not enough care was taken in delivering on appealing mechanics, and Tarkir Dragonstorm mostly stands or falls on a handful of individual cards while being pretty underwhelming as a complete set. The third major Magic release in 2025 was Final Fantasy, that also came with corresponding Final Fantasy Commander decks. This set featured characters and events from all of the 16 main Final Fantasy titles, Final Fantasies 1 through 16, a lot of legendary characters, events from those games. That aesthetic, along with a big focus on alternate card frame treatments, a lot of booster fun stuff, serialized cards, a focus on collectability, appealing to fans of Final Fantasy. That kind of stuff contributed to this being the best-selling Magic set of all time, just off of pre-orders alone. But we'll come back to aesthetics in a second here. Let's talk about the mechanics of the set real quick. The new mechanics in Final Fantasy were Towns as a land type, Job Select as the new snap-on make a creature your equipment comes as a creature mechanic, tiered spells, and summons. So in order, Towns, not a lot going on here, largely tapped lands. There's a number of cards that care about Towns. This was a big retail limited thing. Certainly something you could apply to a lower powered cube, something that I would expect to see more support for in Magic. Really easy to do this again. Stuff like this in Deserts, really easy mechanics to repeat, and something I expect to see more of over time. There's been some cool designs with this already. I like Town Greeter a lot, mostly because it's a human Satyr Wayfinder. Honestly, for my purposes, the mention of Towns can detract from the card by kind of saying that something matters that won't necessarily matter in a lot of spaces where you want that card. In fact, Town Greeter has seen quite a lot of play in Standard for reasons having nothing to do with Towns. So Towns is pretty basic, not a lot going on there, not a lot to report. Job Select, as I kind of already alluded to, is just the third version of a mechanic that we've seen a lot of. Living Weapon made 0/0 germs that snapped equipment onto them. For Mirrodin, actually, that might be my favorite mechanic. Setting aside the specific cards, I like shouting for Mirrodin when I play one of the 4 Mirrodin equipments. That one makes 2/2s. Job Select makes a 1/1 hero, and you attach the equipment to it, and that name is kind of weird. I mean, this is not new design space. There's not really a lot to talk about in the design. This is a cool way to do equipment. Both Living Weapon, for Mirrodin, great mechanics. Job Select, now we have 1/1s. There's nothing about the mechanic that involves selecting jobs, so the name's a little bit weird. That's specifically an aesthetic thing for Final Fantasy. I like a lot of these cards. Black Mage's Rod is a very popular card, a pretty big popper player there, and one you can certainly cube around. Big fan of anywhere equipment mattering, making it so the equipment come with creatures. It's a good way to get the volume of equipment up in your cubes, but again, we're not really breaking ground with this mechanic. Similar to Tiered Spells, which is just the millionth different iteration of Kicker, but this one is very flavorful and evocative of Magic in the world of Final Fantasy. I should say, worlds of Final Fantasy. Fire Magic may be the most iconic here. This is one that sees a good amount of constructed play. What these do, you cast them for some base mode. So Fire Magic's 1 red mana instant, deals 1 damage to all creatures. You can pay some additional costs. So for 3 mana, that one does 2 damage to all creatures. And then for 6 mana, it does 3 damage to all creatures. So it follows the nomenclature of Magic in some of the Final Fantasy games. Fire Raga, that kind of thing. So nothing too flashy with those first 3 mechanics, but I'm a huge fan of summons. These are sagas that come with a creature attached. They tend to have the name summon, whatever the summon is, and you get your regular saga. There's some number of chapters with abilities that trigger after your draw step, and also chapter 1 when they first enter the battlefield, and then you have a creature that you can attack with until you reveal the final chapter and they go away, the same as any other saga. These ones have been pretty fun to play with. I really like them. It's kind of interesting to me. Mark Rosewater describes them as a successful way to do creatures with a drawback. He frames them as creatures that have a drawback because you have to sacrifice them, but because of the association with sagas, they feel like sagas with upside of being a creature. That's how I think about them anyway. There's some really fun stuff in this space. Though a lot of these designs, they are really specific. The power level on these can be kind of high, so they don't fit into a ton of environments. But anyway, where enchantment matters, I'm a huge fan of this. Just giving you the ability to attack more, getting involved in combat. They're kind of like super sorceries, which is really what sagas are in general. You know, they are an enchantment. They can queue off of enchantress stuff, but they give you one-time effects. And the other thing is they can pay you off for multiple turns of controlling them. And the creatures on these, they can really change the shape and the texture of these. Some really fun stuff in this space. Summon Knights of the Rounds are really flavorful and fun design. As a big fan of Final Fantasy VII, I love that one. Summon Bahamut's are really cool, big, colorless creature. I definitely like this card type. And that's the most ambitious mechanic in the set for sure. I think that the idea and the execution are both great. The other thing I do want to shout out mechanically about this set, there's just a cycle of lands with an adventure. I believe they're all towns. There's a cycle of rare lands, one for every color. They enter the battlefield tapped, and they have an adventure you can cast. So if you use the spell first, then you can get the land later. That's just a really cool implementation of adventure. As far as the individual cards are not that appealing. Some of that is that this set was standard legal on release, so how powerful do you want to make a non-legendary land that has some upside? We've seen some of that stuff at extreme power levels lately, the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty channel lands being the loudest example of that. You don't want to push this stuff too hard. It's something I'm interested if we'll see more adventure lands at the future, because these ones, they're just kind of not quite powerful enough to show up in constructed decks. They do have varying levels of appeal for Cube. I think Midgar, City of Mako, the black entry is probably the most appealing, but it's just kind of a basic effect. The lands enter tap, so there's not a ton going on here. I'm watching this space in the future, but just that entire idea of a land with an adventure, that's really appealing and exciting to me, even if this cycle didn't fully get it right. I like that they played it a little bit conservatively. It would be bad if these were too powerful, but I'm interested if we see one that's a little bit more juiced so it shows up a little bit more often in the future. For the most part, though, the Final Fantasy set is a lot of top-down designs built around familiar characters. For the characters that I know, I think that they did a great job. There's a lot that I really enjoy. I did design a cube around specifically the game Final Fantasy VII, a tubert that I call Return to Midgar, a name that I find very clever. That cube involved using a lot of the cards from the Final Fantasy VII Commander deck. So talking about those Commander decks, there's 4 total precons there. They're each based around a specific Final Fantasy VII game. Those are 6, 7, 10, and 14. I pre-ordered the entire set of decks knowing I would need and want the Final Fantasy VII one, and I am familiar with a lot of the earlier titles, so just a little bit about my history with Final Fantasy. I have played through Final Fantasy VII. I've beaten all of the early titles there. I've dipped my toes a little bit into 8. I don't love that one. I have not been able to get myself to play it to completion. Final Fantasy 9 I'm kind of familiar with, but don't really know. Beyond that, 10 and anything later, I don't really know those characters. And my appreciation for this set actually lines up with the characters I know. I'm just more excited, more willing to read what the Cloud card does than certainly the double-faced cards of the characters that I don't know from 10 and onwards. The 10 and 14 Commander decks, there's some pretty powerful, like some of those summons are in those Commander decks, and the power level is kind of high, the complexity on some of these cards are kind of high, and there's no resonance for me. I don't know these characters, and I don't necessarily want to know these characters, and them being on a Magic card doesn't make me feel more inclined to know them. When they start showing up in constructed Magic, when I interact with them, I can see more reason to get to know them. There's been some of those sagas on some of the Magic Online cubes. I see them there, though, and that doesn't really excite me. Like the Good King Mog, like, yeah, that's a strong card, but why is it here? It's not a Vintage Cube staple. There's nothing that necessarily appeals to me about that being a Magic card. And so in that way, I definitely understand some of the aversion to Universes Beyond going there, right? Where the characters that I know and like, I'm excited to cast them. The characters that I don't know, I'm not necessarily interested in getting to know. There are some more mechanically simple cards, like Zell Dinch, as I think is a really cool design. It is from Final Fantasy VIII. I did know the character, but I don't like Final Fantasy VIII, so it's just kind of a cool red landfall card. I like that design there. But the ones that get more complicated, certainly, like I know that there's some double-sided legends like Clive, and they're like creatures on the front and summons on the back. And that's just a level of complexity where until that card becomes very widely played, I am not going to be the one to first put it in my cubes because it's a big ask. It's a big ask for me to read it. I'm not going to ask my players to read it. And so that's where the aesthetics of Final Fantasy as a set is really what the set stands on. And importantly, there are players who love Final Fantasy X and 14. That's why those were chosen as commander decks. Players that love 16. All of the titles, there's somebody that really loves those games and those characters and is excited to see about some of them on Magic cards, the same way that I connected with the Final Fantasy VII characters in commander deck, the same way I see some appeal of the mechanics in the Final Fantasy VI deck. There's players that are dipping into those decks for the +1/+1 counters and some of those stronger sagas as well. I don't say this to be dismissive of anybody in that space. This is all just to say that the aesthetics matter and they do cut both ways. Mechanically, the set plays very well. A lot of the mechanics, they are a little bit safe. I mean, Job Select is just something we've seen before. It's a great mechanic, but it's not new. I like the way they played it. I like the designs here. And Retail Limited for Final Fantasy is one that a lot of players really like. Full disclosure, I have never drafted it. I'm not somebody who really enjoys Retail Limited. I would rather play Cube than Retail Limited. But it went over very well. So I have to say the mechanic execution of the set is good. But I can speak from my own experience and certainly from what I've heard from a lot of players' experience. Until these cards become familiar in some other capacity, I don't want to get to know these characters through Magic. If someday I play Final Fantasy X, maybe I'll pick up that Final Fantasy X Commander deck and start playing more of those cards. And it could be the case that because the Final Fantasy VI Commander deck plays with Sacrifice as a theme and plays in the graveyard, I like that and I'm more willing to read those cards mechanically than the +1/+1 counters theme that's either in the 10 or the 14 deck because I have a graveyard theme cube. There's something to that for sure. But I think that there is a lot going on with the aesthetics here, and this is an aspect of what I was talking about of 2025 being a year that's all about specifics and aesthetics being a really loud thing going on. And yes, Universes Beyond is, of course, an aspect of that. The fourth major Magic release of 2025 was Edge of Eternities, which also came with two commander decks. This was Magic's first foray into science fiction, I guess science fantasy. I'm not super versed on the difference, but anyway, people were excited to see some space in Magic, and people were also excited to return to an in-universe set. That was some of the celebration about this set aesthetically. For me, I think that the aesthetics of this set are really loud, and there's some stuff that I didn't really vibe with at first blush. Let's go ahead and talk about the set mechanically, though, and that'll kind of unpack some of the stuff that I had some difficulty digesting at first. So the new mechanics in this set were stations. That's going to be spaceships and planets where you can tap things to add counters to them until they become operational, is the word I'm going to use. Lander tokens, which are the newest artifact token you can make for 2 mana. You can sacrifice them to search your deck for a basic land to put them on the battlefield. Warp, which tended to be creatures that you could cast for cheaper than their intended casting cost, but then they would be exiled at the end of turn, so you could cast them later. Kind of Evoke meets Adventure, but just a busted version of one or both of those mechanics. And Void, which is very similar to Revolt, which cares about a non-land permanent leaving the battlefield under your control this turn, or you warping a spell this turn. You get some kind of boon if you did either of those things. I think Landers is a pretty cool mechanic. There's not a lot you can do with it. Part of the issue there is you could make a lot of maps, a lot of clues, a lot of treasures, a lot of bloods, whatever, all these artifact tokens that we've seen before, and you could make use of a high volume of those. How many times can you pay 2 mana to search your deck for a basic land and continue to want to do that? So the space is more limited with Landers. I like the idea. The execution here is fine. There's some nice cards that make landers, but there's not a ton you can really build around here. Like, they give you a volume of artifacts that can play in a quantity matters kind of thing for just having artifacts on the battlefield, but that's not something I expect us to see a ton more in the future. This is going to be every 7 or 8 years kind of thing, unlike clues and treasures, which became beloved and almost evergreen almost immediately. Station is a mechanic that gets low marks for me. I think that it's cool in a way, and it really loudly communicates what the set is about. We're going to space, there's spaceships. The cards tend to be pretty weak. Really, where we see them in Constructed is they have the ability tap a creature you control. Like, there's a cycle of lands with Station, and they show up in Constructed decks specifically because there's some creatures that are more valuable if you can tap them the turn that you play them, and it's easier to play these lands than to give those creatures haste, and if you did give them haste to risk attacking with them. So they're just kind of like safe ways to tap your creatures, which is kind of cool discovery, I guess. But these cards, they don't really deliver on these are a cool spaceship, a cool planet thing happening. And they have their own card frame, which was really loud to me during preview season. And it's fine that the mechanic is something that's like for limited, for world building. As far as the way that it plays, it just has not been very satisfying to me. It was kind of jarring to me looking at the file and seeing that card frame. To be fair, having this card frame, which loudly tells me, don't read this card, you're not going to care about that, there is some value to that. You know, making sure that all of the station stuff is kind of modest and then having a card frame so it's easier to scan the file. That is valuable. I can't speak to whether that is their intent, but I do see value in that if that is what they did intentionally or not. Void as a mechanic loses me a little bit more because the reminder text on there, the fact that it calls out if you warped a spell this turn, it's pretty easy to know what's going on with a permanent leaving the battlefield, and you can just gloss over if you warp something, you know what it is or not. But during preview season, every time I would read that, make sure, do I know what this ability does? And then you have to ask yourself, how big of a deal is warping going to be? I know it's just one mechanic for one set. It's going to come up more in limited and constructed. I can choose to make it matter in my cubes or not. But when there is this extra line of text there that you have to read every time, luckily, the void cards are just not that strong, but it is just another aspect of the aesthetics of the set. I don't mind there being space and magic, and I don't mind there being characters from Final Fantasy games that I don't know in Magic. Just as I read them, I don't enjoy the act of specifically interacting with them. I don't have to. With Magic, you choose the cards you play with. It's a game. You can choose to play it for fun. In tournament context, you always have to abide by the rules of the competitive atmosphere. There's nothing that they're going to do with a new card that's going to be worse for me than the experience of playing the Pro Tour where Oko was legal and standard, all right? Like, there's mechanical stuff that is way worse than the aesthetic stuff. You can ignore this. But for evaluating during preview season, it was something that kind of wore on me. And this was my first episode of the podcast here was a cube review for Edge of Eternities. And it was before I kind of started trying out the aesthetic, like the mechanic and thematic focus, and then individual cards. So Edge of Eternities cube review, I was pushing myself just to put something out there. And it's regrettable that that was my first episode. I definitely was feeling the wear. I was not ready to celebrate what I liked about the set. There are things to like about the set, but I really felt wore out by the things I didn't like about the set. My perspective wasn't the best. So that being my first episode and the execution of that, I don't feel great about that. So there you have the superlative for my pick for my worst podcast of the year. It's fair that the first episode be the worst episode. That is kind of natural, I suppose. If it ends up being the worst episode I ever record, I suppose I should be happy with that. But there's one more mechanic in Edge of Eternities to talk about, the warp mechanic. This mechanic is really strong. I mean, I guess it depends how you use it, what cards you use it on. There is a range going on there. And I like this mechanic on modest cards, and I personally really dislike this mechanic on some of the strong cards that it appears on. So the whole deal with warp is it's kind of a modal mechanic, except you end up getting to do both things over time. So you warp cards, they often are able to do something the turn that you warp them, and you still just have access to them later. I like the uncommon kind of value stuff in this space. All Fate Stalker, Starfield Shepherd, I think are really cool cards. I enjoy Pinnacle Emissary. I think that that card is a pretty positive impact on constructed. It's very specific. You can queue with it in very specific space. Susarian Voidborn is a really strong Blood Artist, but it does something really unique. Being able to warp a Blood Artist effect for 1 mana is really cool. You can get into more combo space with a Sacrifice deck, and Sacrifice is really a combo deck in a lot of contexts, so I enjoy that card a lot. I'm a really big fan of Nova Hellkite. That's a really cool execution of a dragon. When it comes to 5 mana hasty dragons, I am so big on Thundermaw Hellkite and Glorybringer. I kind of hate Goldspan Dragon because it doesn't hold a candle to those other two dragons. Like, I think that those cards are cards that I really hold to a high degree of reverence. Nova Hellkite gets to enter the space and it doesn't bother me as much. I'm cool having it in the same environment as those other dragons because of the ability to warp it for 3. It's really cool interacting with cheap creatures and planeswalkers. I enjoy that design a lot. The card that I hate is Quantum Riddler. This card does so much, and this is because I love Mole Drifter. So a lot of my card evaluations, they do come in context of the things that I like and how the cards compare. Quantum Riddler is stronger than Mole Drifter in no fewer than 5 ways. When it comes to power maxed environments, it is absolutely true that Muldrifter has been outmodded. It cannot hang in Vintage Cube anymore. That's fine. Quantum Riddler is just kind of replaceable in that space. I like what this card does for Modern. Having a thing that you have to spend mana on that's good to ephemerate, that's perfect for Modern. I have not enjoyed what this card has done for Standard. It's something that is too strong for the original recipe Tubert. I'm not interested in this in mid-range spaces. And extra card draw is generally replaceable. You can just do other things in high power environments. This is a card that I just really have enjoyed playing against. It is not the kind of Magic that I want to play with in Constructed Magic, so the high power warp stuff, it hasn't really sat well with me. It's kind of similar, the power level of this set is very similar to how I feel about Tarkir or Dragonstorm, where a lot of the designs are cool, like the mechanics, there's hits and misses. A lot of the mechanic stuff is generally forgettable. But then there's just a couple of cards that are just pushed so high of a power level, but not quite to Vintage Cube stable, where I should be happy that there are people that like these cards, just environments you can play them with, but they become so specific on power level where you kind of have to be power maxing Legacy Cube for them to really be appropriate for a lot of environments. Something that actually fascinates me about Warp is that there's not a Warp card that just warps for more than you cast it for. And the comparison point that I have and why I'm thinking about that is the plot mechanic from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. One of the best new mechanics we've seen. It probably ranks pretty highly for me for mechanics all time and how great it plays. And with plot, we saw so many different implementations. There was stuff that plotted for less than the casting cost, stuff that plotted for more, some that plotted for the same amount, and there was appealing and engaging ways to do all of that. With Warp, it's like do it for cheap and do it later. That's just kind of less exciting to me. It's space that I would like to see explored more. I have kind of a sour taste about just how pushed so many of the Warp cards are. That's not necessarily the fault of the mechanic, though. As I've sat with this set more, I do think that some of those more modest Warp cards, Nova Hellkite, Susari, and Voidborn, they are awesome. There's a lot of context to play with them with. The station stuff doesn't bother me as much. It's a retail limited thing, it's a world building thing, and I want to acknowledge that there are people that are very excited about that aesthetic. So it's something that I kind of tune out. I'm able to tune it out. That is great. Some people are going to like it. That is great. And there's a lot of individual cards in the set that play great, setting aside my reservations about some of the highest power stuff and some of the lowest power stuff. The stuff in the middle, Umbral Caller Zealot, is one of my favorite cube cards printed this year. So it's not like Edge of Eternities is a dud. I wish that I was able to get myself in a headspace to be more excited about the set before I did my initial cube review. I understand why people like this set. It's not one of my favorites this year, But the highlight reel is quality, and there's some pretty good stuff in the commander decks too. The big highlight for me there, continuation, not yet completion, still waiting for the rest of the two color cycling dual lands. Big fan of that. Some other players are going to be excited about the Battle for Zendikar land cycle being continued. Really cool just to have more typed duels. Baloth Prime is one people really like in the landfall space. I really like the design of Horizon Explorer. It's another one of those cards that's really simple and elegant, makes sense for two-player games that shows up in Commander decks. I'm always happy to see that. Pretty solid sampling from the Commander decks here. So Edge of Eternities has a really specific aesthetic, and I am confident there are people that love this set. People were really loud about being excited about this set when it was coming down the pipeline. So I think that mechanically, it's really specific, but there's some hits. There's a good highlight reel here. I have come around on the set, and there are people that have loved it from the start, so I have to say that Edge of Eternities was certainly a success from where I'm sitting. The fifth major Magic release of 2025 was Marvel's Spider-Man, a set that, to put it lightly, comes with a lot of baggage. It is really popular to hate on this set. You can score some easy points at social media just saying a completely hollow statement about how the set sucks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that today. I mean, like, the Through the Omen Path stuff is awful. It's really unfortunate not having a digital one-to-one correlation with the physical cards. That's really unfortunate. The aesthetics, the red and blue spider suit can be really loud on an individual card. But once you actually have the cards in your hand, they do broadly just look and feel like Magic cards, at least to me. You just give a passing glance to most cards as you play them. There are some exceptions, some cards that are really aesthetically loud. Amusingly, Secret Identity, the art that has the RK Post homage to RK Post's Unmake, is actually one of the cards that's just the most red, blue and red spider suit that really just is loudly Spider-Man and feels a little bit tonally weird in Magic. To the set's credit, and this has nothing to do specifically with Spider-Man, but this is the set where they stopped using the horrible Universes Beyond frame. That's actually a really negative mark for the Final Fantasy set. That stupid frame with the weird coloration and that meaningless triangle that's always there in the text box. That frame was so bad, and something that I think Spider-Man would look completely awful if it had that frame. A lot of the cards do just look like normal Magic cards, and part of that is that they retired that horrible frame. That was a really good step in the right direction with Marvel's Spider-Man, at the very least, aesthetically speaking. And the set had some other problems that had to do with a lot of things behind the scene. The size of the set changed multiple times in development, so you come up with a weird number of cards. You end up in a retail limited environment where you have a small set with a lot of legendary creatures at low rarity, so you have to draft around the fact that you have a 3-mana 3/3 that's legendary with very little additional text, and how many copies of that kind of drawback can you support. The set certainly reinforced something that I already believed. I'm pretty big on singleton in my cube designs, and multiple copies of the same legendary card are something that seems really awful to me to do in cube, and this set, drafting this set, that experience definitely reinforced that prior that I had. And the set definitely has issues with retail limited, but something that people have kind of just latched onto, just hating every aspect of this set. People will joke about pick 2 draft, but I think pick 2 draft and some aspects of designing Marvel Spider-Man for 4-player drafts are actually really good. And there's some innovations in this set that if you didn't pay attention, if you just wanted to block it out of your mind, you wouldn't have noticed these things happening with Spider-Man. But there are some good innovations here. I'm going to link an article written by Corey Bowen in the show notes, something that they really did, and there's some aspects of this I'll dig into a little bit. I recommend reading the article. They wanted to make the set more draftable for a 4-player pod. Some of that is the smaller set. Some of that is just 4 is a very common playgroup size these days, with a lot of people getting together regularly to play 4-player commander pods. This is a way that's more natural to just take that same playgroup and do a draft. They designed around that something that I wouldn't have put together until I read Corey's article, is that the set, they do the 5 ally colors. So they go for 5 strongly seeded archetypes instead of the 10 you would normally see, one for every 2 color pair for most retail limited environments. And the way that they leaned into that, it actually clicked for me. That's really similar to a lot of the stuff I structurally did to make the original recipe Tubert tick, the 4-player drafts there. They benefited a lot from what I did, seeding every monocolor as just a deck. So that could be something that would be playable out of the box, and the draft shakes that up. But there's 5 colors, so that's 5 archetypes. 5 ally colors, that's 5 archetypes. And there's some wiggle room. So if you have just kind of 5 really natural lanes and 4 players, it's pretty easy, or inevitably it'll shake out, where for the most part, 3 or 4 of the players should have something pretty coherent. And then in the original recipe Tubert, there's more ways to mix and match. There's gold stuff in all 10 colors. And Spider-Man does a little bit of that too. There is 2-color gold rares for all 10 color pairs. And the enemy colored rares are pretty good flagships for doing something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, a little sideways draft, like the Spot, the Orzhov rare. Even though there's no black-white fixing land outside of the 5-color lands in the set, if you pack one, pick one, the Spot, you can do something pretty cool and unique in the environment. So you seed strongly for 5 archetypes, drafting with 4 players. You have some options for sideways lanes, and it makes the environment pretty fun to explore if you can get to playing it in the first place. A big problem with Spider-Man is it couldn't get a lot of players to play in the first place. I've heard from local LGS scenes for draft, a bunch of people wanted to do 8-player drafts, and it's just like, you shouldn't draft this set with 8 players. It's not designed for that. I don't care if you don't like pick 2, just like do literally anything else with your time. Like, you should not draft this set with 8 players, but it does do some things that actually are really innovative and good for supporting 4-player drafts. The other big thing is there's more hybrid mana at common in this set, and that's something that we're going to see more of. I think this was a great innovation that's really useful for making it so the lanes are a little bit more fluid. If you have more commons that are green-white hybrid, those can go fully into the Celestia deck, but then they play in Gruul, they play in Azorius, so there's more room to play and explore between the different lanes. Even though you're fully pushing for 5 ally color pairs, there's more flexibility there. So that use of hybrid mana, it's not a new mechanic, but the execution of having more in common, that is innovative in Spider-Man. So I do want to give credit where it's due here. There's some good stuff happening with Spider-Man. Of course, it is to salvage some disastrous stuff behind the scenes. I'm not trying to pretend that that's not the case. I just do think some really good work was done here, and a lot of fun game pieces were produced by the set. Mechanically, web slinging, mayhem, they don't really fit really into the broad scene of Magic. Mayhem is broadly just worse, if easier to understand madness. Web slinging is so loud aesthetically that I don't expect players to play a lot of these cards. And I think that that's honestly maybe intentional. The Spider-Man set's power level is quite low. I think it's convincingly the lowest power level of the year for any of the sets, commander decks, whatever. There's just not that many cards that are so strong that you have to play them. This set has produced very few highly played constructed cards. So the fact that it's really aesthetically loud, and then you have the different digital cards, it's all really negative. But at least the power level is designed where the Spider-Man cards seem mostly designed with the express intent of them only really being played with other Spider-Man cards. For that reason, I did build a Spider-Man Tubert. It's pretty much just cards from the Spider-Man set and the supplemental products there. Nothing outside of that. Like, I used the welcome decks is where I deviated from the main set. And it's pretty fun. There's a lot of fun cards in this set. The transforming modal dual phase cards, I think that those designs are a great way to do 3-color cards where they're monocolor on the front, and there's a stronger 3-color payoff. Gwen Stacy is one of my favorite cards of the year, certainly for Cube. I love that one in the Powered Arena Cube, even though it was whatever the hell the Through the Omen Pass card is named. The design is fun. So there's some good stuff here. I get it. There's a lot to dislike, and I'm on board with disliking a lot of it. However, this set is better than it is perceived, and if you are paying attention, there's some good design notes here. I recommend just learning some things about this set, both in terms of the game's history. I tend to find that stuff very interesting, but there are useful design notes here as well, especially if, like me, you are interested in developing 180 card environments, specifically environments where 4 players will be drafting, which tends to translate pretty well to 2 players drafting as well. So there's good stuff happening here, even though aesthetically there's a lot of issues. The behind the scenes stuff, very bad. There are some good designs here, though. And the sixth and final major Magic release of 2025 is Avatar The Last Airbender and the corresponding Jumpstart release. That's going to be something that came out pretty recently, so not too long ago I did my cube review of that set. The mechanics there, you have the 4 different types of bending: fire bending, water bending, earth bending, air bending. You have lessons, allies, and shrines as things that show up in packages in the set. The aesthetic is, of course, after the animated series Avatar The Last Airbender. It's something that I actually watched for the first time just a couple years ago as an adult, but I have a lot of friends who grew up on the series who were really excited about this set aesthetically, and it makes sense. There's a lot of really charming characters in the world, and something that people do say is that the bending stuff to them really makes sense just with regard to magic and how they mesh aesthetically. For me, bending versus the stuff we see in other Magic sets, it is kind of loud, it is kind of specific, but I do like the designs. It's not anything that really turns me off. And unlike the Final Fantasy Commander decks, the Avatar cards, even though there's cards that aren't really for me, that I don't especially like, I do really like everything working here as world building and making it really easy to build like a set cube or a commander deck around Avatar. That's kind of the thing about Final Fantasy with all the different games is I built specifically a Final Fantasy VII cube, which was a lot of work using a Naya commander deck and assorted cards from one set. It's kind of tough to zero in on a specific game when every game has its own storyline and there's 16 in the same set. Avatar is probably the best set of the year for really exploring a set cube because you have the main release, which has been the same size the entire time the set was developed. It deals with one story being told with all the same characters that interact with each other, and the Jumpstart set builds on that and gives you some stuff that did not have to be printed at a power level for standard, where you can modulate the power level as you do so desire from there. All of the different types of bending I think are pretty well designed. They play well. Firebending is kind of the miss for me of the lot, but I do like the way that firebending kind of synergizes with waterbending, which suggests the harmony of the 4 elements there in the world. So I like the design. There's some stuff that's more for retail limited. Honestly, a lot for constructed in the Avatar set. This set is really powerful in terms of its immediate standard impact. It's possible that this is the most powerful constructed set of the year if you're specifically looking at the impact on standard. Lessons have been massively impactful in standard, and that's with this implementation where we're not even seeing a learn. This is just cards that say lesson and cards that care about lessons. That stuff's really pushed, and earthbending is really pushed, giving you the ability to animate lands, and you always get the land back, whether the land is destroyed or even if it's exiled by some means. Airbending is really powerful both to protect your own things or to temporarily remove your opponent's stuff from the battlefield, making them pay more later. That's a real cost. There's also some kind of messed up interactions where if you airbend something with an adventure, then you can cast either the creature for 2 when you cast it again, or you can cast the adventure for 2. I don't know how intentional that is, but that is a really powerful interaction. The airbending combo deck in standard takes advantage of that. That's something you can explore in your cubes as well. It's the kind of thing where if it became really popular and was very widely represented and constructed, it's really unintuitive to me. The rules around this kind of stuff with like cascade and casting stuff from other zones and which half of a card you cast when there's like a modal thing, either double-faced cards, adventures, all those mechanics. It's something that rules change have happened around before. I'm not calling for that right now, but there's some unintuitive and weird stuff. Specifically, airbending adventure creatures is bizarre space. But anyway, lessons, I like the implementation here. If you want to play with them, you kind of have to really break Singleton, I would think, to really make lessons work in a cube with the way that they're implemented here. Maybe you can do it Singleton, looking at Strixhaven, if you combine the lesson and learn. We're going back to Strixhaven next year. So it's something you can certainly explore. More allies is cool. It's a really specific creature type. It tends to just be a threshold mechanic. That's one where previously you kind of had to break Singleton to really make it appealing. It's something that there's just more cards, and the power levels are pretty disparate here. There's some really strong allies and cards that support allies relative to certainly original Zendikar stuff. But more tools in a popular and explorable space is something I always like to see. I'm a huge fan of the new cycle of shrines. More shrines is something that I'm working on a design that I want to cube with. I've always been a fan of Hondens. I have made my feelings about loving original Kamigawa very clear, so I like saying that. I think that aesthetically and mechanically, the Avatar set really delivers. It makes sense to me why this set is so immediately beloved. The only mark I have against it is that it does seem like a lot of the cards are really strong. There's some stuff like Wan Shi Tong that's going to be kind of like a legacy, like a power maxing card only. But it's fine for cards to be powerful. That one's not breaking constructed or anything. And the thing that's arguably breaking constructed, of course, the lesson deck tore up at Worlds. I think Standard has corrected a little bit, but we're still waiting to see how that plays out. There's a couple of pretty significant Standard events coming up here in January. I'll actually be doing commentary for two of them here, the Spotlight, the Avatar in Atlanta, and then the Regional Championship at the end of January is going to be in Portland. So I'll be doing commentary for both of those. Been playing a good amount of Standard. I have found that players are adapting pretty effectively the lesson plan, but when you have that big event, people are going to be working really hard, definitely on the regional championship. So we'll see how the format catches up there. I don't think Avatar is like problematically powerful. There's some stuff that is really pushed. Standard has a ton of cards in it. We're on the 3-year rotation, and the way that multiple different things from Avatar showed up immediately, it shows that the power level of the set's really high. So where Spider-Man is probably the weakest set of the year, Avatar makes a good argument for being the strongest constructed set of the year. And when you factor in the jumpstart stuff, there's enough individual cards that I think there's a real argument for Avatar being the strongest set of the year in aggregate, but there's nothing that's really offensive. There's been a couple of cards that have had to be banned over the course of this year. In general, there's some stuff that for my sensibilities is pushed a little too far, but it's fine for people that like to power max to have some new toys, and the Avatar set, I think mechanically, has some really cool designs, showing off this world and how everything plays together. This is a great limited set, really nice, coherent aesthetics. I think that the Avatar set really delivers really well-designed environment here. Not to mention that the Avatar set just has a number of individual cards that really stand out as fun game pieces to me, isolated from everything else. Phoenix Fleet Airship, the vehicle that copies itself if you sacrifice something this turn, and then once you have 8 of them, they're automatically crewed. That's such a cool story in one card and kind of a quest contained in one card. Zhao the Moonslayer, the 2/2 that wants to destroy the moon, and you pay 7 mana and it becomes a Blood Moon effect. Such a cool design, both in terms of storytelling for the source material, world building for the source material, and also contextualizing that in the game of Magic and making that make sense in a game with as much history as Magic with that Blood Moon reference there. Huge fan of that design. And there's that cycle of monocolor utility lands, the ones that enter tapped unless you control a basic land, and they all tap for, one of the 5 colors and have an ability. Some of the designs there, like Abandoned Air Temple, really stands out in terms of white utility lands all time. And you can compare this to, there was a cycle, something kind of similar in Tarkir Dragonstorm, where they spoke to the clan identity. Like there's an island that enters tapped unless you control a mountain or a plain, so it represents Jeskai. But that is just kind of weirder, more specific, harder to make fit in an environment unless you're really doing that 3-color thing. These cards just read a lot cleaner, and they're just a lot more satisfying in terms of how they play. Some of those Tarkir cards, maybe they have effects that are more appealing to you, but just from top to bottom, looking at an individual Magic card, I'm a huge fan of that land cycle in Avatar. So top to bottom, a lot of care went into this set, and the execution here I think is pretty excellent, both mechanically and aesthetically. And that's going to be a wrap on my 2025 Cube Year in Review. So, kind of going over how the mechanics of each set landed, the aesthetics, and how people, and certainly myself, feels about how all of the releases this year have landed and their impact on Magic. The important thing I want to highlight, certainly as a Cube curator, is that we get to pick and choose what we engage with. And that's important because I think that this year does have something for everybody. I think that the highs are very high. There's some stuff that I really love, the stuff that resonates with me really speaks to me. Even a set that's generally disliked, that designed that set cube around Spider-Man. There's some stuff that's really fun for me, even if it's not for everybody else. And I think that while it's true that there's something for everybody, there's something that everybody is going to dislike this year. There's a wide range of aesthetics. There's a wide range of power levels and mechanics. I think that Ether Drift and Avatar, if you bookend this year, both of those sets did a lot of things really exceptionally. But even with them, I understand how the aesthetics from one set to the other are going to land better or worse with a given player. I think mechanically the executions there are excellent, but the loudness of the aesthetics and the specificity that results for that and what's going to be for who is really on display this year. And if you look ahead to 2026 and the announced sets for that, it's going to be more stuff in this space. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. I think that it's really good to have such high highs. You can argue that it's really bad to have low lows. I think that there is a point to consider that if you hate something, importantly, it means that you're not indifferent. And I think an important aspect of that is you have to hit those high highs. As long as you hit the high highs, that's going to make people feel the low lows, and that's going to be the full experience. Like, if you don't love it, you won't be able to hate it. So they're continuing to make stuff that people love. From my seat, they're continuing to make things that I love. And on balance, a number of the themes explored this year, they're revisitations of things that we've seen before that have been popular, things that I've liked. They've branched into some new space that I'm excited to see more of in the future, and even some of the stuff that wasn't really for me. I understand how there's going to be players that are going to be more excited to see more of that as well. So I just want to reiterate, I think that 2025 is very much a year of something for everyone, and definitely if you isolate on an individual card level, every set has a good highlight reel of things you can consider, kind of no matter what you like about Magic. Even Spider-Man, which you could say you hate blah 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 XYZ about it, Multiversal Passage is such an excellently designed land, both for constructed and for a modest 5-color land that you could put into a cube that's going to play in 2-color decks, that's going to play in 5-color decks without making it so you have like the 5-color, the blob problem, just that modest design. And that's even an upgrade of something printed this year, like Starting Town from Final Fantasy seemed like a good thing in that space, but then Multiversal Passage just blows it out of the water. So a lot of really good design work this year. A lot of stuff that was released this year. I designed multiple cubes, a Final Fantasy VII two-bert and a Spider-Man two-bert around releases this year, and I can point to how it would be really fun to explore Ether Drift as a world for a set cube. The multiversal race thing is really fun. Speed is a great mechanic that enforces that aesthetic. Avatar seems like an awesome set as far as exploring a set cube, and the tonal world building there and how the experience would be very coherent and very fun if you love that source material and is mechanically well designed enough that'd be fun to explore even if you're seeing it for the first time. Final Fantasy really landed really well mechanically. People really enjoy that draft environment. The aesthetics are a little bit more jarring with all the games mixed together, but there are people that know and like all of those games, and there are people who are just going to be able to tune that out and enjoy the mechanical experience for what it is. 2025 definitely feels like we are firmly in a new era of Magic from when I started doing Cube content. When I was first writing articles, every set release, it felt like there's something everybody can latch onto. I think if you look at individual cards, every set still has some good hits, but from set to set, it makes more sense to me why somebody would want to disengage from an entire set of Magic in aggregate. If you look at the entire year, I think there's very much something for everybody. If you pull the highlight reel, there's a lot of great individual cards, there's a lot of themes, and enough great themes where somebody's gonna like at least a couple of them, and you can explore that and how you want to design your cubes. But it's just more true that you're going to be tuning out more of Magic, which is a natural consequence of just how many cards they're making, how many releases there are next year. There's 7 major releases next year. I know a lot of players experience fatigue around that. For me, I'm always excited when new cards come out. I personally am always happy to see what's coming down the pipeline, but I am hearing how a lot of other players are feeling fatigue around the release schedule and all of the announcements all of the time. The word that I keep coming back to is specificity. I think that if you have the patience to have an awareness of everything happening in Magic and you can tune into the stuff that you're really excited about, the highs are high. And I cannot stress enough how monumentally important that is. For me, I'm getting a little bit from every set. There's stuff that I'm excited to go hard on and explore totally new environments with. And there's always at least a few cards. And with my podcast here, I'm going to try to do my best to highlight what seems exciting to me in aggregate. People are going to be able to latch on to the stuff that they are the most excited for themselves. And I think that Magic, with that specific nature of releases this year, the way we engage with the game, it kind of just has to change. For me, it's going to stay the same. I still enjoy poking into things, figuring out what's for me, what I like, what they're doing with Magic now. I'm still playing a lot of constructed and casual Magic, so I'm experiencing a lot of the game. I have my ear to the ground. I hear how a lot of it's just not going to be for everybody, but importantly, with that specificity, it does very much seem to be the case that when they print the thing that is for a specific player, that player is really excited about that thing. Whether it's sci-fi and Edge of Eternities, whether it's returning to the plane of Tarkir, whether it's Final Fantasy, even for a very small percentage of the audience that is specifically excited about Spider-Man. I mean, I think that my Spider-Man cube, it is fun. I'm just going to say that one more time. The Avatar set, major hit for Avatar fans. So the highs are high, the lows are low, but the love of the game persists. There's great designs. Magic is as fun as it's ever been. And when it comes to Cube and you get to pick and choose what you play with, I think that Magic only ever gets more fun over time. Just tune out the stuff that you don't like. Choose your experiences. And on that note, on the topic of choosing your experiences, thank you one last time this year for spending your time with me and listening today, for liking, commenting, reviewing, sharing, subscribing, whatever you do to support the podcast. Word of mouth means a great deal, but just you choosing to spend your time with me here every week, that really means a lot. So thank you so much. I hope that your year has been kind to you and that next year is better still. Thanks again, and I will be back next year talking more Cube. Later, gamers.